Hello, everyone. Welcome again. I hope everyone is staying safe. I hope everyone is staying healthy. And I hope that everybody is social distancing and doing everything they need to do to keep not just themselves, but everyone else safe too. Once again, my name is Kevin Impellizzeri. My pronouns are he, him, his. You can also call me Doctor. And welcome to This Isn't Pac-Man Anymore, the 1993 moral panic over video games, my 8-part series that tries to answer the question of how video games got age ratings in the United States. If you've been watching for all of my other episodes, thank you. If this is your first episode, welcome. Thank you for watching. Either way, if you've missed an episode, the full playlist to all 6 previous episodes are down in the description below, as well as information about the entire series, which you can check in a link below to my website. Here's a recap of what we covered so far over the past 6 episodes. Noisy. Part 1, we introduced the series and asked the simple question of what is a moral panic, and introduced some theory that was going to cover the rest of these episodes. Then part 2, we examined briefly video game anxieties before 1993's moral panic over video games to examine why what we're talking about now was different than what had come in the past. Then, for parts 3 and 4, we examined 2 entertainment and technological trends, and fads, if you will. Those were the virtual reality craze and FMV games, which were both having a certain level of popularity in the late 80s and early 1990s. Then we shifted over to a larger anxiety over violent crime. And the previous week, we went from the concerns over violent crime to anxieties over media, which led us to the anxieties over video games, which then led us to our 2 primary targets of moralist activism in 1993. Those were Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. Well, today, we're finally getting to examine, we're almost to the finish line with this, because today we are going to examine Part 7, the video game hearings. Video games go to Washington. So before we get into a little bit of theory, on December the 1st, 1993, Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut, who is here on the right-hand side, held a press conference denouncing violent and sexual content in video games. Accompanied by Captain Kangaroo host Bob Keeshan and members of the National Parent-Teacher Association, he called for the industry to develop a regulatory system to monitor game content, threatening legislation if they didn't comply. And he announced that the first of what would be 3 congressional hearings examining video games would take place a little more than a week later on December the 9th, 1993. So we're going to talk a bit about these congressional hearings and examine them contextually. I'm going to actually skip ahead for a moment to our overview because what we're going to do is we're going to place these congressional hearings in the context of what we've seen so far, the violent crime panic, the VR craze, the FMV games, and how these led to these anxieties over video games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. What we're seeing here is a culmination of everything we've talked about over the past 6 weeks going into this one. We're going to use something we learned about in episode 1 and then heard about again in our episode on the crime panic, moral panic theory, to understand this response to video game violence and explain why this was in the theoretical sense, a moral panic. We'll examine what the industry's response was to this pushback against their industry and how well they responded or how poorly they did. And finally, it only took us 7 episodes, but finally we're going to get around to the creation of video game ratings in America. We're finally almost across part of the finish line. So before we actually get into the hearings themselves, I think it's important to have a brief refresher on moral panics, something we've talked about a bit over the last 6 going into 7 episodes. First, our definition again, moral panic, which I've defined as a sudden backlash against a perceived threat to the moral order, the general impact of which is overstated or non-existent. Moral entrepreneurs are the people who wage these moral panics. They can be lawmakers, they can be activist groups, they can be members of the media, they can be parents, they can be teachers. Any of these people who push this as an important issue, regardless of whether or not it actually has the impact they say it does or not. And in fact, oftentimes moral panics are reflections of larger anxieties that these moral entrepreneurs have. They often say more about them than they do actually about whatever target they're at. And their targets are generally things called folk devils. This is a target of moral panic that embodies concerns of moral decay. This again going back to a theory developed initially by Stanley Cohen in the 1970s. Eric Good and Nachman Ben Yehuda introduced 5 characteristics of moral panic, which we're going to examine by applying them to the panic over video games. And those were concern, hostility, consensus, disproportionality, and volatility. So concern being an anxiety over a specific target or issue, hostility in the sense that it's a negative response to it, consensus in that there's one concerted argument that tends to drown out nuance or counter arguments. But this target is usually disproportionate to its actual impact. Either it has very little impact on the specific concern, or it's not, or the threat is non-existent, or it has no connection at all. Again, about correlation and causality and things like that. And volatility. Often these moral panics don't attach to the popular consciousness for very long. They kind of come and they go and ebb and flow. So that's what's going to help us understand where we are in terms of anxieties over video games. And as I said, these culminated in the series of 3 hearings. The first was on December the 9th, 1993. The second was on March the 4th, 1994. And the third was on July 29th, 1994. And they were primarily conducted by 2, the Senate's Judiciary and Government Affairs Committees, and with those, the subcommittees on juvenile justice and regulation and government information. Now, there were 3 hearings. We're going to, in this episode, focus specifically on the December the 9th hearing, because the December the 9th hearing was like, it was like your Seinfeld Festivus. It was your airing of grievances. This was where all the cards came down on the table in terms of anxieties against video games. And we're going to see how this hearing specifically became a culmination of all of those bigger concerns about games, about the future potential of things like interactive movies and virtual reality, and these persistent concerns over violence and violent crime. The subsequent hearings were more essentially cleaning up what had come out of the December the 9th hearing. March the 4th, the video game industry introduced a trade organization that updated Congress on their progress for the development of a ratings system. That's the ESRB. We're getting there almost. And then on July the 29th, 1994, was the introduction of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board and rolling out the mechanics of it. So in terms of our analysis, we're going to talk mostly about the December the 9th hearing. So let's meet some of our players, our dramatis personae, if you will. Actually, before I do that, before we get into that, I want to point out that as I said, Congress and Senator Joe Lieberman were threatening regulation of and federal mandating of ratings to the industry if the industry didn't do it themselves. Well, a lot of members of the video game industry saw the writing on the wall and tried to get ahead of concerns over video games. In early December, it's usually been reported that it was several hours before the opening of the hearing on December the 9th, 1993, about 140 game companies got together and announced that they were launching a video game ratings system. This was mostly spearheaded by Sega, and you can see a lot of their influence in the way this rating system was supposed to go, because the rating system was based on the Video Game Rating Council, with the idea that these 140 game companies would agree to have 3 different tiers of labels. GA for general audiences, MA13 for mature content, like a PG-13 rating, not suitable for anyone under the age of 13, and an MA17 for adult or mature games. And this was signed off by a bunch of the industry, but I will say there was one distinct holdout: Nintendo. Nintendo would not sign on to the video game ratings. Nintendo and Sega had numerous debates in the press about whether or not games should be rated, because Sega had the VRC, or the Video Game Rating Council. Meanwhile, Nintendo focused on the importance of internal regulation of content by Nintendo. Nintendo had specific content restrictions that they mandated both for their games and any licensees for Nintendo systems. So basically, Nintendo was kind of the centralized arbiter of what was acceptable and what was unacceptable on Nintendo. And you can imagine how some licensees responded to that. But that was the assertion of Nintendo, was that there didn't need to be a rating system, that'd be this responsibility. At one point, Peter Main, who was Nintendo's marketing director, accused Sega of, quote, throwing up, quote, smoke screens to justify the marketing of increasingly violent games. So Nintendo's assertion was that Sega was just doing it so they could make adult games, which part of you could say, well, duh, that they're trying to cater to an older audience. But their assertion with this was that Sega was going to profit off of these ratings somehow, since they were the ones helping to develop it. And in fact, lawmakers rejected this idea, again, with the concern that Sega was going to somehow influence the rating system and somehow use this against companies to their own advantage. So their initial attempt fails, and that leads us to the December the 9th, 1993 hearing. So let's meet some of our players at this, starting with our lawmakers. Senator Joseph Lieberman, who oversaw the proceedings, was at that point a Democratic senator from Connecticut. He eventually became an independent before he retired, but he oversees primarily the hearings. He's joined initially by two lawmakers. One is Senator Herbert Kohl, who was a Democrat from Wisconsin. He was one of the executives for Kohl's department stores. If you've heard that name, that's where it comes from. He was also one of the owners. He was the owner of the Milwaukee Bucks at this point. Gosh, you remember a time when sports still existed? But yeah, he was overseeing the Bucks at this time. And joining them was a Democratic senator from North Dakota by the name of Byron Dorgan. And Dorgan was involved in a bunch of these pushbacks against the media. There was a later congressional hearing against rap music, and Dorgan was on that as well. So this was kind of one of his issues as well. There were numerous panelists that came before Congress in 1993. They were kind of divided into three categories. The first set of them were educators and academics. In that category were people like Parker Page, who was a representative from the Children's Television Resource and Education Center, which was an organization that emphasized informing parents and educators about promoting social development in children using television for it. Along with him was Robert Chase, who was representing the National Education Association, which is the largest representative and lobby organization for educators in the United States. And with him representing academia was this guy here, Eugene Provenzo. Eugene Provenzo was, and still is, a professor of education at the University of Miami. And part of the reason they probably brought Provenzo in is because a couple of years before this, in 1991, he published a book called Video Kids Making Sense of Nintendo, in which he examined the content of a handful of Nintendo games, or games specifically made for the NES. And he overall concluded that video games overall were violent, sexist, and racist. Before we talk about more speakers, let's unpack his book a little bit. His book is interesting. On the one hand, his argument is not a new argument, though his attempt to use quantitative data for it was kind of new for the time in terms of analysis of instances of violence and depictions of racism and sexism in video games. But he's very alarmist in his book. I also can't get over his factual inaccuracies. For example, he repeatedly in his book refers to the Activision game system, even though no such system exists. He either meant the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, which by the time he published his book, both of them had long been since defunct, or possibly he meant Astrovision, which was also a very short-lived company in the early 1980s. This also came across on other academics that he was kind of this alarmist tone. Um, I love this shade thrown by a reviewer of his book from the November 1992 issue of Contemporary Sociology, and nobody can throw shade like academics. The writer of his review said, quote, Provenzo is well-meaning, but his arguments are so devoid of subtlety and grounding as to make his volume read like an extended graduate student paper. Ouch. And representing media activism and watchdog groups was Marilyn Droz, who was a representative of this group called the National Coalition of Television Violence. And longtime viewers may recall I mentioned the National Coalition on Television Violence very briefly in our first episode, because in the early and mid 1980s they partnered with Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. That was Pat Pulling's organization, and they worked together to try to get the federal government to attach warning labels on D&D materials and other tabletop RPGs, asserting that they promoted things like violence, crime, suicide, and the occult. NCTV is an interesting organization. They were founded in 1978 by a guy named Thomas Radecki, who at the time was a psychologist. And their whole thing was that they monitored for what they called quote-unquote instances of violence per hour. They would watch blocks of television and monitor violence. So their definition of violence was kind of broad. It could be anything from, like a brutal murder in, say, like Scarface, Tony Montana, shooting down people while doing cocaine, to, a cartoon character throwing a pie at somebody. They have a very broad definition of violence. Radecki himself, this is a side thing, is kind of a fascinating fellow to say the least. One of the reasons he was not one of the representatives here is probably because a year before this, in 1992, he was stripped of his medical license to practice in Illinois because he was found to have, quote, been engaging in immoral conduct of an unprofessional nature with a patient. And in fact, he is currently serving prison on an 11 to 22-year sentence for offering medications to female patients in a drug rehab program he ran in exchange for having sex with them. So he's not what you'd call an upstanding citizen, or like can attest for the rest of his organization. But he had given the outs when the troubles had started coming for him. Anyway, less drama aside. Aside from the representatives of the academic, educational, and sort of media watchdog communities, we're kind of ancillary market representatives. These were not direct representatives of the video game industry per se, but represented things like coin-operated amusements, video retailers, and computer software, and represented by such people as Eileen Rosenthal of the Software Publishers Association, Don Wiener of the Video Software Dealers Association. Eileen Rosenthal represents computer software in general. This was their organization. Don Wiener represented software dealers, so these are so retailers, renters, anyone who sold computer software. We've got Craig Johnson from the AMOA, the Music Operators Association. These are people who rent or buy coin-operated machines like arcade cabinets. And then there was one more panel of people representing the video game industry itself. Oh, we'll get to them. That's going to be a whole section to itself. So like I mentioned at the outset, this hearing on December the 9th, 1993 was kind of a culmination of all of the anxieties that we've seen over the last several weeks regarding the future of media, technology, and the role of video games within that. So let's, before we go into that, let's meet our targets here. Like I said in the last episode, we have Mortal Kombat. The martial arts fighting game was taking the home world by storm in late 1993, just as it did in the arcades the year before that, after versions of it were released on Mortal Monday, September 13th, 1993, for the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Sega Game Gear, and Nintendo Game Boy. Nintendo, in accordance with their content restrictions, cut out most, but not all, of the violent content from Mortal Kombat, replacing blood with sweat, for example, toning down some of the fatality moves, although there were still finishing moves in it. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move on. I had a video here, because in contrast, Sega had the Sega version of it had all the violent content in it, so long as you unlocked it through a secret code. I'm actually just going to skip ahead and show you a different video. Now we're going to do this video. And the other one was Night Trap. Night Trap was an FMV game in which you monitor surveillance cameras through a house that's armed with traps, and you try to capture these vampire-type creatures who try to capture people during a slumber party. Now, this one is a video that I tried to show last week, and I think it's important to understand what people's understanding was of Night Trap. So we've got a brief video. It's about a minute. This was what was shown to Congress in the December 9th hearing to show what Night Trap represented. So we're going to play this for a minute. And this was an infamous scene. I mentioned it a bit in last week's episode, but I wanted to actually show you it.
Megan, this isn't gonna work. You're not scaring me. Wait. What are you doing now?
A scene that might have changed video games forever. And we'll talk a bit more about that. And if you want to see a more detailed thing about it, feel free to check out my previous episode on Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. So, no, there we go. So, like I said, this is kind of a culmination of all those anxieties. But the thing you really need to understand about why this happens when it does is we need to start with the crime panic, because that's kind of the central nexus of all these other anxieties over violence that come out in 1993. And concerns about violence and violent crime was a lot of the influence for the concerns over video games at the time. Whether or not those were justified given the statistical representation of real crime, probably not. It was probably overstated. And again, feel free to check out my previous episode on that. But suffice to say, concerns over violent crime then permeated into concerns over violence in society, which then shaped anxieties over violence in the media, which then led to concerns over media such as television, film, music, and then video games. And in fact, when Lieberman called the proceedings to order, he mentioned, in part specifically, the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas and the December the 7th shootings on a Long Island commuter train, which resulted in numerous deaths. He said, quote, "Every day the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Just this week, the dreadful story of the young girl abducted from a slumber party from her home and then found killed. A man on a commuter train begins coldly and methodically to fire away at innocents on their way home, killing 5 and injuring many others. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives, and I think it's time to draw the line. I know that one place parents want us to draw the line is with violence in video games, and this is where we turn from the violent content in society or the perception of violent crime into video games here. The fact is that a new generation of video games crosses that line, containing the most horrible depictions of graphic violence and sex, including particularly violence against women. Like the Grinch who stole Christmas, these violent video games threaten to rob this particular holiday season of a spirit of goodwill. Instead of enriching a child's mind, these games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture." Going further than that, in just the depictions of violence, he also emphasized the use of guns in games, brandishing this peripheral called the Justifier, which was for the Sega CD version of Lethal Enforcers, another game we briefly mentioned last week. So this is kind of where we had this starting point with concerns over video game violence and the crime panic. In addition to that, was the fact that video games were extensions of these other new media. This is where we get anxieties over virtual reality and FMV games and this idea of interactive television. On the one hand, we have this concern about depictions of real people in these. This is pervasive in the FMV games, where you have digitized representations of live actors in live scenes. Mortal Kombat, again, using digitized sprites, so they actually look like real people enacting these things. And games like Night Trap and other FMV games that use actual people. You may recall a few episodes ago, and again, I'm going to be referring back to a lot of them because this is where we culminate all those things. I said there were kind of two big concerns over. We'll talk about that in a moment. One of the concerns that Lieberman, Cole, and other assembled moral activists had was that they warned what future games could entail if there were no limits set on video game content and design. Recall in part 3 when we talked about the VR craze. I wanted to go back to a quotation that I kind of paraphrased a few weeks ago, which was Jaron Lanier, who was a founder and advocate of VPL research, who allegedly was the person who coined the term virtual reality, talked about virtual reality as this new way of experiencing the world, and in fact experiencing virtual worlds and creating a more personalized experience. And he said at one point, in virtual reality, you don't just play Pac-Man, you are Pac-Man. In virtual reality, you don't just visit Epcot Center comes to you. In virtual reality, every person is an astronaut, every person is Donald Trump, every person is Top Gun. And the flip side of that was that there were these concerns that theoretically the same technology that could allow a person to not just play Pac-Man, but become the eponymous character chasing fruit and avoiding ghosts, could also allow a player to be Sub-Zero ripping out people's spines or Kano ripping out people's hearts. These are some, they could do this. This could happen. And that was one of the concerns. And this idea of not just what was happening now, but the future potential of these kinds of technologies was on the forefront of the concerns of lawmakers and other moral entrepreneurs at the time. So, for example, Herbert Cole said this during the hearings. He said, "We need to make every effort to reduce this culture of carnage, and we need to make that effort now, because with interactive technology and virtual reality, these games are going to be more sophisticated and persuasive." And Senator Slade Gorton of Washington said, "It's time to look into our future and think about how these games are likely to be coming into our homes, over our computer monitor on the electronic highway," because that's at one point what we call the internet, "and over our cable lines in real 3D, lifelike forms that will be totally interactive. Kids will have more and more exposure to these games, and parents will have a harder time trying to make choices and control what they see and do." In fact, Eugene Provenzo likened video games to the Feelies from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, this idea of this fully immersive sensory experience. And he went further to say that that video games represented what he called, quote, "the first stages in the creation of a new type of television, an interactive medium as different from traditional television as television is from radio." And in fact, to assert his point, he actually acted out punching as though he was using the Sega Activator. And this idea of the interactive nature of video games becoming a big target of concern. With that was also, when we're talking about media, I mentioned a few episodes ago that there's this kind of concern about media in general, that there were kind of one of two things that could be happening with violent depictions of content, and those were desensitization and replication. And again, going back to larger anxieties about things like when we talked about that movie, The Program, with people lying down in the street, or Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, or Beavis and Butthead with Fire, that on the one hand that we will be so desensitized to violence we won't be able to react properly to the real thing, or we might carry out violent acts themselves. So, for example, Herbert Cole said this. He said, quote, "Experts can debate whether entertainment violence causes brutality in society or merely reflects it. But there should be no dispute that the pervasive images of murder, mutilation, and mayhem encourage our kids to view violent activity as a normal part of life, and that interactive video violence desensitizes children to the real thing." In a prepared statement, Utah Senator Orrin Hatch speculated that this may lead to real violence, saying that video game violence, quote, "coarsens society and promotes active violence against real victims. In real life, violence has consequences that cannot be undone by pressing a reset button or inserting another quarter into an arcade game. But when children are desensitized to violence by these games, they don't learn this until it's too late. And Marilyn Droz of NCTV asserted this as well, saying, all our actions as teachers are undermined by the moment that they go to the video game and they learn that the only way to solve a problem is to kill them off. So these anxieties over what does media do, what does this mean for crime, and is there a connection between real crime and digitized crime, and this idea of being able to physically act out those kinds of things. These become real concerns, at least concerns in the eyes of the moral entrepreneurs who were talking about this. And with this was not just that video games represented a new form of technology, maybe a new form of television, was also that video games were dangerous toys. This came out a lot in the hearings as well. Now, this is an interesting time for video games, not just as a medium, but also for its players and its users. Now, the idea of who a video game user is and who video games are targeted is actually a really complicated question. I actually talked about it a bit in my dissertation, and there are other people who have talked about it in significant detail. I talked about Carly Cook's book, Coin-Operated Americans. I talked about Michael Newman's book, Atari Age. You should check them both out. They're really good on that topic. But in the 70s, a lot of video games are marketed towards middle-class families. And even in the 1980s, as they're starting to target a younger audience and an audience more generally populated by boys, there's a weird kind of push and pull with advertising to assert that video games are something for everyone. What Arnie Katz, editor of electronic games, called in the early 1980s, called the universal appeal of electronic games. And you even see advertisements for Atari games that are trying to court mothers, as showing them that video games are not just safe for their children, but that they can play them too. But after the crash in the 80s, and like I said, that might be a future series, there's a more direct focus on children as the directed market for video games. That is specifically what Nintendo is targeting by the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. However, there's now and that's kind of the public association. I mean, Nintendo had a stranglehold on the market going into 1990. And Sega becomes kind of an upstart, changes their marketing strategy, and becomes a big competitor to them. We'll talk about Sega in a second. But Nintendo's emphasizing this thing of video games for children. And as a result, a lot of the public perception, even for people who don't play games, such as is covered in the media and it's asserted through its advertising, was that video games are kids' toys. They're something children should have. And this then creates a tension over video games if they're targeted towards older audiences, because one of the big marketing strategies beginning in the 1990s for Sega was that the way that they were going to cut into Nintendo's hold on the market was that they were going to focus on an older audience. They were going to focus more on teenagers and even develop games for adults. And even some of the other FMV developers are kind of developing adult-oriented software on game systems. The 3DO and the CDI are examples of that. And FMV games in particular, as I mentioned last week when I talked more about Night Trap, tend to try to show an appeal to video games in terms of an older audience and that they could deal with themes that were maybe not suitable for really young kids. And this creates a bit of a tension over who video games are for and what then can be depicted in them, which then leads some to argue that video games that have violent content are now dangerous toys. For example, Bob Keeshan, who I have over here, who played Captain Kangaroo on the eponymous television series from the 70s into the 1980s, said at the December 1st press conference alongside Joe Lieberman that video games, quote, are not harmless toys. They can indeed cause great emotional and other damage to a child. And like I mentioned in the previous episode, Joseph Lieberman added, we now require warning labels that could potentially, on toys that can potentially damage children's bodies. Why not do so on a toy that can damage their minds? Therefore, for some of the advocates for either ratings or regulation of video games, this became an assertion of consumer safety. It was a consumer safety campaign to protect children from a predatory industry driven by profit. Some of the quotes that come out of this hearing emphasizes the idea that video game companies are selling and peddling these products for money, not concerned about what the impact is. For example, Parker Page said, The Sheldon Sullivan Research and Education Center commented, with the emergence of enhanced human-like graphics, video games that allow young players to participate in heinous acts of cruelty, misogyny, and inhumanity should not be portrayed regardless of profits. Robert Chase of the National Parent Teachers Association, this is those quotations here. Robert Chase of the National PTA argued in the interest of corporate responsibility for regulation of games, saying, quote, I think business leaders who produce games and toys or whatever for children have the responsibility to ensure those games and toys enhance our society rather than tear it asunder. However, the most direct and sharpest criticism came from Eugene Provenza, who said, I mentioned this quotation a moment ago, who said, you are profiting off of the American child to an enormous degree, speaking directly to the games industry. What are you giving back to the American child? How are you making life for children in this culture better? I don't have much evidence of that, not much evidence of that at all. Where are the good games? Where are the programs for children based out of your profits? I think they have a moral obligation. Maybe they don't perceive that. They are making a huge amount of money. This is profitable, extraordinarily profitable. Where is that money going? And in fact, in news coverage leading up to the hearings and after the hearings, a lot of the emphasis was on how much money the industry was making, creating this correct connection that they're making huge profits off these violent video games. And so it's interesting, that assertion of where are the good games, which we'll talk about that in a second. We're going to do another slide first, because you can't escape this discussion about video games and sexism and video games of representations of women. This isn't a new issue. They were talking about this in the 1980s. We're still talking about it today. We're still grappling with that today. Whether some fans of the game, video games like that or not, this has constantly been a topic. Again, going back to the idea of video games as something that was marketed more directly towards youth, going even further than that, Nintendo's marketing more directly towards boys, as are other game companies. Their assertion is that this is the target demographic, so we have games that appeal to that. And as a result, that leaves a really problematic position for women. And most female characters in games are depicted as damsels in distress, people to be rescued, or depicted in sexualized terms. I know this is kind of an obscure game, but it's kind of indicative of a lot of these representations in advertising of either stricken women or scantily clad, or emphasizing attraction to a stereotypically heterosexual male audience, which is something the games industry is still grappling with to this day. And again, this idea of women as damsels. And then concerns then come about how video games are then represented to women, and what does that mean for female players. And so there are a lot of concerns about this at the time. I just thought it was important to mention that. This was actually one of Marilyn Drose's big points she emphasized over and over again, was that video gaming was, because of these kinds of decisions, was excluding women and girls, and therefore, by extension, women and girls were becoming less interested in technology and STEM-oriented careers as a result of that. There's a lot to unpack with this. And the depictions of also sexuality in games becomes a big issue. I mentioned this last week when we talked about Night Trap. And again, this sort of tension over who games are for, and how do we cater to that audience. And a lot of coverage of the hearings and talking about Night Trap in particular, talk about specifically in that capture scene I showed you, here's a still from it, that this woman is scantily clad, and these women in pajamas throughout there. Oh my goodness, the scandal over that. And then, in addition to that, is this concern about, again, where are the good games? Good games and bad games. This is actually a really common tactic in moral panics, is that the idea that the current iteration of a thing is a corruption or a bastardization of what came before it. And we see that a lot when talking about video games in this context. Lots of comparisons to Pong and Space Invaders and Pac-Man. And we finally get to why I named this series what I did. Senator Slade Gorton of Washington, who said, "Wake up, and Mom and Dad. This isn't Pac-Man anymore. Pac-Man and Pong have been replaced by Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, games that glorify violence and show our darkest nightmares on video screens." Lieberman again said, "The fact is that a new generation of violent video games crosses that line, containing the most hard depictions of graphic violence and sex, including particularly violence against women." This is an interesting rhetorical tactic in Moral Panics because it does a couple of things. One, again, it tries to set up a contrast between one iteration of media and earlier versions of it. But what's interesting about that is that it's very ahistorical because, and we know this because of what we talked about with video games, that anxieties over video games have a long history, and there were anxieties over Pac-Man. And again, we talked about things like the places where these games occupied. Is the obsession with getting that high score going to turn children into delinquents who skip school and try to hassle people to try to get money for more of those precious quarters? Or are video games like this even, are they physically harming people? Are they causing diminished attention spans? Are they causing eye strain? Are they causing that infamous Space Invaders risk that physician from the University of Arkansas talked about that he was suffering from in 1982, which he reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so it in a way legitimizes these earlier forms of media and ignores these older anxieties by doing so. And video games are no exception to this. A great example is music. Music panics happen generationally, and in fact, they're generationally in the sense that the current target is usually the target of anxiety of older people for what kids like, kind of forgetting that their music was also. For example, when in the mid-1980s, there was a congressional hearing over violence and misogynism and sex in rock music and heavy metal music in particular, and there were comparisons were made. Why can't they be like Elvis anymore? When if we go back to the 1950s, and the concern was about Elvis and sex and delinquency and loose morals and all of that stuff. You could even go further back than that. It's okay, oh no, Elvis is pushing sex. Why can't we go back to jazz and ad infinitum and on every generation like that? And we see that with video games, this idea of sort of good games and bad games, and that line prevents us says, where have all the good games gone? Which I just found fascinating. And again, it helps legitimize earlier video games, and controversial though they may have been in their own time, and turns them into acceptable parts of American popular culture. So in some ways, this isn't the only reason. This is one of the things that helps cement games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders as part of, or what makes things good in society. And it's fascinating. It comes in cycles and generations. And with all this, there was all these concerns about video games when we talked about, good games versus bad games, this new, harsher generation of video games. Video games as being sexist or promoting violence towards women or promoting sexuality. Video games as representing the sort of interactive violence and the future horrible potential of that, and then leading into concerns that it might lead to real life crime. There was no greater threat than good old Night Trap. Night Trap encapsulated all of these fears about VR, interactive movies, games now for an older audience as opposed to children, depictions of violence, sexuality, and the depiction of women in particular. It's fascinating the way to talk about Night Trap because to think of Night Trap, we talked about last week kind of the way the media portrayed Night Trap as a sort of violent, brutal game. Here's what some of the, all of the ire was directed almost specifically at Night Trap, saying things like Byron Dorgan called Night Trap, quote unquote, a sick and disgusting video game, which he said was the objective was to trap and kill women, and in fact described the act of playing the game as child abuse in and of itself. I can tell you for a fact Byron Dorgan never played Night Trap. Marilyn Droz of NCTV said, "How would you like to have a teenage daughter go on a date with someone who has just watched or played 3 hours of that game?" Specifically saying about Night Trap. Dorgan again, saying, "I think it's pathetic and shameful that the conclusion of a game like that is to grab a woman with a metal hook and drill in her neck. I don't view that as constructive entertainment." Again, not really knowing that this is a fail state and that the objective of this game is to prevent that kind of capture. Which when this was brought up to people like Dorgan and Droz and others, they basically turned on it and said, "Well, so if you lose, you die," and so there kind of really was no defending Night Trap from this. And they go back to the things like meat hooks and wine bottles that I said, assertions that women are being hung up on these big bloody meat hooks like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and their blood being drained from them and decanted into wine bottles. In fact, Eugene Preventive, specifically said, "For a child playing Sega's Night Trap, this fantasy world includes torturing women with machines and murdering women so their blood can be sucked and decanted into wine bottles." In doing so, and in fact, they called for it to be banned, specifically. Night Trap becomes kind of the ultimate violent video game. And it's interesting that their calls to ban it, but not Mortal Kombat. And Night Trap by Tom Zito, head of Digital Pictures' assertion, sold about 100,000 copies. Meanwhile, Mortal Kombat, by the end of 1993. Meanwhile, Mortal Kombat, the home versions of it across all 4 platforms by that time, had sold about 4 million. You were significantly more likely to come across Mortal Kombat than you would have Night Trap. And I would argue this is one of the big reasons why Night Trap becomes kind of this ultimate folk devil, because it's got a more limited audience. It came out initially for an expensive add-on to the Sega Genesis, the Sega CD. Eventually, in 1993, there was a version of the 3DO, also an expensive system. So not a lot of people were actually playing this thing. And if they did, the gameplay, I'd argue, is not very good. Most people would have just given this maybe a passing glance, and were it not for this controversy over it, it most likely would have faded into obscurity again, along the lines of games like Double Switch and Ground Zero Texas and Sewer Shark and a bunch of those other FMV games that kind of ended up being footnotes in video game history. Its obscurity allows activists to project on it whatever they like. The fact that they didn't play it helps them. It helps eliminate nuance for that. They can broadcast these images of this woman being captured in a hook with no context. And they can say, this is what's wrong with video games, and this is what we need to stop. It's a convenient target for that, because who's going to counter them? Who is playing Night Trap? Who is wasting their time when games like Super Mario World or Sonic the Hedgehog are out? It makes it really easy for them to shape this narrative over it. We're going to go into consensus in a minute. And so it becomes this perfect cipher for everything they're talking about. And so they're able to shape this discourse against games to suit their needs by portraying an example of a video game that had transgressed beyond any accepted notions of decency, with no room to counter their assertions. Again, who is playing Night Trap? Now you might wonder, like I said, about eliminating nuance with a kind of concern like this. You might be wondering what the industry is doing to talk about all this. And the short answer is not well. They did not have a good response to this at all, quite frankly. You might be familiar with the console wars. Nintendo and Sega are in this aggressive marketing war during the early 1990s. Nintendo is cutting into Sega's business by assorting a hipper, edgier, more in-your-face kind of experience. They vastly outsold Nintendo in terms of the licensed versions of Mortal Kombat for the Genesis over the Super Nintendo version. Players resented the fact that the games content was cut. It suffered both critically and commercially as a result of that. And so there's this big conflict between the two companies. And they brought that into Congress with them. And their two avatars to do this were, on the one hand, was Bill White, who was the vice president of marketing over at Sega of America, and his counterpart was the vice president of Nintendo of America, Mr. Howard Lincoln. Um, they they snipe at each other throughout the whole hearing. A lot of the assertion between the two of them was finger pointing, with Bill White asserting that Sega had, emphasizing the video game rating council that Sega had, and saying that Nintendo, you don't have a rating system. And meanwhile, Nintendo saying two things. One, we don't need a rating system because we are regulating our content internally. And two, we never published Night Trap. That became a big point both in the press and Howard Lincoln, saying that Night Trap would never appear on a Nintendo system. And I will say as an aside, it's very convenient that, because probably the real reason why Night Trap didn't appear on a Nintendo system is because it didn't have the technological capabilities to do it. If you recall, Sony at one point was in a deal to make a CD-based peripheral for the Super Nintendo, and that deal fell through. And then Sony eventually made the PlayStation to compete with Nintendo. And then they tried to make a deal with Philips to make a CD-based system, and that deal fell through. So it was less that any kind of moral objection to Night Trap, and probably more a technological reason. But that didn't stop them, from Nintendo and Howard Lincoln, from using that as a cudgel to beat his opponent with. In fact, Howard Lincoln was a lot more adept in Congress than Bill White was. Lincoln was a former trial lawyer. He was a judge advocate general before he ended up becoming involved in Sega as a legal counsel, and then as their vice president. He was a lot more adept at navigating Congress, and he was really good about directing the ire towards Bill White. White, meanwhile, he appeared ill at ease during the hearings. He flubbed a couple of lines in places, a couple of slips. He at one point broke out a super scope to say these are the kinds of guns that Nintendo is pushing, and by accident he said that this is the thing that Sega is pushing. So he's a little less quick on his feet during these hearings. And also, Lincoln, again, is really good about directing the sort of finger pointing in Congress back at Sega. He's pretty adept at that. For example, White emphasized, part of his argument was not just that they had a video game rating council, but that games like Night Trap were for an older audience. At which, when Lincoln was asked to respond, he said, "I can't sit here and allow you to be told that somehow the whole video game business has been transformed today from children to adults. It hasn't been. And Mr. White, who is a former Nintendo employee, knows the demographics as well as I do." So effectively putting a former coworker on blast over this. So we're seeing this Nintendo versus Sega battle, and as a result of that, we're not seeing any counter to the consensus. In fact, Howard Lincoln, representing Nintendo, said that sure, there's terrible violence in some of these games, specifically the ones that are being made by Sega. There is no counter that maybe these are for an older audience or any kind of thing. So it does leave what might have been. And the reason I talked a lot about the anxieties over video games in episode 2 was to talk about what kinds of responses could have been, and Nintendo and Sega did none of them. First off, there was no dedicated lobbying firm and trade organization for video games. There were these extensions of it, like the Software Publishers Association, but nothing just for video games. So they had no unified interest, and they had no unified message, and no unified representative to represent them. So it looks, from the public side, that it's everyone against everyone in the games industry. On top of that, they could have challenged the consensus. Nintendo and Sega could have put their differences aside and said that this is going to threaten everybody to do this. For example, think of Atari. Atari in the 1983 published Video Games: A Public Perspective, which was, or 1982, my apologies, which was a video that talked about the social benefits of video games and the communal benefits of video games. They they sponsored a symposium at Harvard Graduate School of Education in May of 1983. asserting with speakers from academia, asserting the benefits of video games for health, education, and science. They could have had something similar and brought their own academics to counter and say, this is what video games do for people. They could have emphasized that they're communal, they're social, they have medical benefits, they have scientific benefits. There was lots of ways they could have done it. They could have asserted that video games were important for mass culture, that they're art. This is after Electronic Arts is founded, and they had that very famous ad that said, "Can a computer make you cry?" They could have done those things, emphasizing the cultural, the educational, the technological benefits of video games. And they did none of those things. They did absolutely none of them. They sniped at each other during these hearings and basically conceded the whole point to the people arguing to them. If you want a counterexample that's not just in the video games market, let's talk about rap music, because there was a similar hearing to this on February the 23rd, 1994, so a little less than 2 months after this one, in which lawmakers argued that rap music promoted violence and misogyny. And meanwhile, there were experts who came in who argued in favor of the cultural significance of rap music, particularly among communities of color. And in fact, even the legislators themselves debated over whether or not is rap music really that big of a deal. And they engaged in debates amongst each other about whether or not it posed any threats to the moral order. And none of that took place on the December 9th, 1993 hearing. So they concede all of the consensus. And again, this goes back, they emphasize Genesis does what Nintendo don't. There's an interesting theory that comes out of this. There's kind of a theory that I want to float for a second, which is, did Nintendo set up the hearings on purpose? Did they feed information to Congress as a way of giving a PR and marketing black eye to their opponents? This has been asserted by a couple of people. For example, Tom Zito, head of digital pictures, who told Stephen Kent in an interview for his book, The Ultimate History of Video Games, said, Nintendo hired a lobbying firm, and the lobbying firm basically started going around banging on doors to see if they could find a congressman who would be interested in taking this up as a cause. Blake Harris, author of Console Wars, asserts in his book that Joe Lieberman took up the cause of video games at the behest of Nintendo of America, that they had invited him to NOA headquarters in November. Then after that, Lieberman issued a letter to fellow members of Congress emphasizing for some kind of regulation on video games. That supposedly the videos that were shown of Mortal Kombat content was actually, and the content of Night Trap was actually funneled to Congress by Perrin Kaplan, who at that time was communications manager for Nintendo. I think there's some validity to that, considering how much they emphasize the violence of Sega's version over the Super Nintendo version. But this is a complicated question, and I don't have a good answer to it. I wish Blake Harris cited sources in it, because I would love to go deeper into that. On the one hand, you could think of it that Nintendo, in a cynical attempt to wage PR points against their opponents, was willing to put the entire industry on blast for it. At the same time, Nintendo was not above that kind of stuff. They really weren't. Matter of fact, Lincoln, following the hearings, issued a press release directed at Sega of America President Tom Kalinske, mocking Sega over its poor showing of the hearing, saying, quote, Dear Tom, roses are red, violets are blue, so you had a bad day. Boo-hoo-hoo. All my best, Howard. So I can't go either way on this. There's certainly some things that might point to Nintendo pushing Congress to do this. Lieberman has asserted that he did it on his own, although Lieberman also has an incentive to say he's the one who helped the industry look at itself and regulate itself in some way. So I'm not sure. It's something I'd have to do more research on. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Oh, we got people chatting. Great. All right, so we're running a little longer today, so I'm going to try to run things a little bit more quickly. I don't want to skip any of this stuff, but we'll try to be a little faster. So the public, largely the public was against Night Trap because most of what they're seeing about it is funneled through that one infamous video about Night Trap. And in fact, there was some backlash among retailers, and this is probably because they wanted to avoid some heat over this. And KB Toys and Toys R Us and FAO Schwartz, about a week after the hearings were done, pulled Night Trap from some stores. Although I will say, and I'll go into this next week, it didn't affect Night Trap's sales too much. In fact, like it did. Overall, in the gaming press, there was general support for ratings, with people like magazines like GamePro asserting that that if you're under 17, there might be some games you can't buy or rent. That's emphasizing that censorship was not the answer, but that regulations would help parents make better decisions and offer more empowerment for consumers. So there's kind of general support in the gaming press about it. Although it's interesting, some people in the press were also saying that maybe the ratings don't go far enough, with the furthest extreme coming from this editorial from the December 12, 1993 edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which said, the industry last week volunteered to a rating system patterned on the motion picture industry's 20-year-old system when Congress threatened to lower the boom. But why not keep the purveyors of violence sweating? With all these new technologies, we're sure that the worst offenders could be offered a choice. Confiscatory tax rates, or a few weeks of Clockwork Orange-style anti-violence rig watching without blinking endless films of hideous brutality. Whoa, dial it back a little bit, Philadelphia Inquirer. So this is some of the conversations. And let's briefly, again, go back to our characteristics of moral panic and why I think this was a moral panic. We certainly have concern about violence in society, violence in the media, and violence in video games, and depictions of things like sexuality and sexual violence in video games. And it is certainly hostile. It's a negative response to this. This is a backlash to it. And as I said, there's a consensus to this in which the assertions of lawmakers is that video game violence is a problem. It needs to be managed, with no assertions of any kind of counter-argument, especially not from the industry itself. Like I said, there was a lot of things they could have done that did not. And probably this is disproportionate. It's actually hard to say whether or not this kind of impact has on the impact of violence in general and media on people's development and behavior is a big question that still hasn't really been answered. I'm trying to find a here we go. In fact, the experts really didn't offer a lot of supporting factual data that supported the idea that video game violence was making people more violent, or if it was making people desensitized. In fact, Eugene Provenzo cited a controversial 1992 study by Brandon Centerwall of the American Medical Association that blamed television for half the murders in America. A very controversial stance. And Parker Page of the Children's Television Resource Education Center actually argued that the lack of concrete data was proof of the insidious effect of video games, saying, quote, all of this research is limited and dated. The overall trends, however, must give cause for concern as we approach virtual reality. What is that data? And again, going back to Night Trap. Really? Night Trap? Again, a game that only came out for a pair of very expensive systems or system add-ons that didn't have a huge reach. What kind of impact is it having on people when it can't even really sell that many? And skipping ahead, this is a volatile movement. Skipping ahead to the very end. This doesn't last long, although it comes back, which we'll talk about in our next episode. So the other thing about moral panics we've talked about is that there's an emphasis of action. Something must be done. Something has to stop this threat. Something has to, rein society in and protect us from these violent, horrible video games. And that often comes in the form of things like regulation or censorship. And in the hearings, the lawmakers threatened to impose legislation that would push the industry, compel the industry to develop a rating system. And after the hearings were over, Lieberman made do on that threat. Introducing on February the 3rd, 1994, the Video Game Rating Act, or VRA. introduced in the U.S. Senate by Joe Lieberman with Herbert Kohl and Byron Dorgan as co-sponsors, and introduced also in the House of Representatives by Representative Tom Lantos, a Democrat out of the 12th District of California. And the bill created an organization called the Interactive Entertainment Rating Commission. This was a committee of no fewer than 5 members who were appointed by the President of the United States that would work directly with the games industry to develop a rating system and then monitor the progress of the industry in getting one. And so that's what Congress pushes. Well, in the meantime, the industry, chastened by what had happened, tried to make some changes to what they had initially introduced. Remember, they tried to introduce a rating system that was based on Sega's VRC model right before the hearings started. Well, they were ready the next time they met with Congress because they formed a lobbying and trade organization called then the Interactive Digital Software Association, which was established officially in April of 1994, as the first trade organization specifically for interactive entertainment software. So this is the one specifically directed at games, both computer and video alike. Its first chair was a guy named Jack Highstand, and Jack Highstand was an executive over electronic arts, and he, from this point onward, became the spokesperson for the industry. He represented the games industry at the March 4th, 1994 hearings. I will say this, Howard Lincoln, something of a friendly witness, who was even complimented by Joseph Lieberman as one of being the few good apples in this whole batch, came back as, again, a friendly witness to the representatives there. At the March 4th hearing, they talked about their progress towards developing a rating system, which they unveiled in July of 1994. It was in July of 1994. You might know the Interactive Digital Software Association as the ESA because that's what they renamed themselves to in 2003. And so beginning in July, they unveiled their new rating system, which we all know now as the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, the ESRB. Introduced at the July 29th hearing. The hearing specifically focused on unveiling the ratings, talking about how they would work, talking about the specific mechanics, and having the support of retailers at the time as well. So the way this worked is that an independent organization, the ESRB, would set up a commission of raters who would rate games on a 5-letter scale based on content and age appropriateness. Those 5 initial ratings were EC, or early childhood, recommended for children ages 3 and older, K to A for everyone ages 6 to adult, T for teen for ages 13 and older, M for mature for people ages 17 and older, and AO, which was limited to ages 18 and older. The packaging, these ratings were supposed to appear on packaging. This is how it looks like today. It's been slightly modified. The appearance of the logos was changed in the early 2000s, and they also introduced 2 new ratings. The K to A rating was phased out in 1998, replaced with E for everyone. And in 2005, E, or for everyone 10 and up, was also created. Games would have on their packaging, on the cartridges and discs themselves. So here's a copy of Wayne Gretzky 3D Hockey 98 for the N64, which had a K to A rating. Here's a copy of Super Smash Bros. Melee for the GameCube, which has the T for T rating. You also notice a sort of pixelated style, which used to be the old appearance of the ratings, and the more sort of block styled letters that's in the modern ratings. It also had to appear on all advertising. For example, in this early ad for GTA Vice City before the game came out, as you can see, it's got an RP or ratings pending rating. And you can even see it in modern games like now. So, for example, Dark Souls 3, which is an M rating. Like I said, it was supposed to appear on all packaging, advertising, and consumer marketing material. The ratings were rolled out beginning in November of 1994 with the goal at that point to have all video games with an ESRB rating by Christmas of 1995. Retailers said that they would not carry any games that didn't bear the ESRB rating and made, in most cases, specific provisions against AO-rated games. with the idea that a delisting from a store would create a financial incentive to rein in content to a certain degree. And we'll talk about the AO rating in a little bit more detail next week. This ultimately, it also wasn't retroactive. So like Night Trap for the Sega CD would not get a rating. However, when it was re-released, because it sold well enough, because maybe because of the hate rings it sold so well, when it came out for systems like the Sega 32X, it had an M rating. Although we'll talk about how Night Trap has been rated over the years next week. But nevertheless, Lieberman did still assert the need for responsibility in content, but he was ultimately, and other lawmakers were appeased by what the industry developed in the ESRB's creation, and the Video Game Rating Act unceremoniously died in committee. So we finally got to answer this question of how they got ratings. So we've gone a little longer than I'd like. We had a lot of content. I actually had a ton of notes. I might publish them online just so you can see what was left on the cutting room floor. But let's recap. The December 9, 1993 Congressional hearing and its subsequent hearings on video game violence represented a culmination of anxieties over crime, new introductory technologies such as FMV games and VR, and the media, and violence in the media in particular. Video games, especially Night Trap, epitomized these larger concerns, although their impact was probably overstated. The panic over video games expressed at the congressional hearings represented a moral panic because it showed concern, hostility. It had this disproportionality, it had this volatility. There was this consensus about it. And that ultimately, under threat of federal oversight, the industry created the Entertainment Software Ratings Board as a rating system that rated games based on their content. Whew. So that's where we've come so far. 7 episodes it took us, and a little longer than an hour and 10 minutes for this one to do it. So, I'll give it a moment if there's anybody watching right now. If anybody has any questions before I wrap up. I like your comment with Westphalians. That could have been you wearing that nightgown being attacked by vampires. Who's to say? What could have happened? What were the future ramifications of that trap? All right. Well, as always, if anybody has any questions, they can leave them in the comments below, or you can check me out online. You can follow me on Twitter and ask your questions there if you like, at KDImpellizeri. That's KDIMPELLIZERI. You can follow the whole series. The link is down in the description. And if you like what we're doing, you can like and subscribe because we are almost to the end of this. We've seen the creation of the ESRB. We've seen the moral panic through to the end. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take next week, Friday, May the 29th, probably at the same time, 4 p.m., and we are going to talk about the influence of the ESRB and the legacy of this moral panic over video games. We're going to ask that ever important so what question. And we're going to figure out, what did it all mean? How did it change how we think about video games? And how did this panic shape anxieties over video games that were to come? So thank you as always for watching. I really enjoy doing these. As I say every week, I hope that this took some time where you weren't thinking about everything that's going on outside the walls of this screen. So as always, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.